April 24th, 1862, 2:00 in the morning, the Mississippi River, 70 miles south of New Orleans. The river is on fire, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The actual surface of the Mississippi River is burning. The Confederates have loaded flatboats with pine knots, tar, and cotton soaked in turpentine and set them adrift on the current. They float downstream in the darkness like lanterns from hell, spinning slowly, spreading liquid fire across the black water. The light they throw is orange and red, and it dances on the surface of the river and illuminates everything in a shifting, nightmarish glow. On both banks, 2 Confederate forts are firing everything they have into the darkness. Fort Jackson on the west bank, and Fort St. Philip on the east, each one a mass of masonry and cannon that has been sitting on this river since before the Mexican War, specifically designed to make what is happening right now impossible. Through this fire and through this iron, a fleet is coming. 17 Union warships are running upriver in column, moving at 4 knots through smoke so thick that captains cannot see the vessel 20 yards ahead of them. The guns of Fort Jackson are firing shells that leave red arcs across the darkness before they hit the water and throw columns of spray 30 feet into the air. The Confederate shore batteries are firing chain shot, 2 cannonballs linked by a length of chain designed to spin and shred masts and rigging. The air is a geometry of death. Every few seconds, another Union vessel takes a hit. Wood splinters, men scream. Fires start on decks and get beaten out with wet blankets. The noise is beyond any description that peacetime language can carry. It is not loud. Loud is insufficient. It is a physical force that presses against the chest and makes the eyes water. On the deck of the flagship USS Hartford, a 60-year-old man is climbing the rigging. His name is David Glasgow Farragut. He is the flag officer commanding the entire West Gulf blockading squadron. The Hartford is on fire. A Confederate fire raft has been pushed by a Confederate tugboat directly into the side of his flagship, and the burning tar and pine pitch has caught the Hartford's hull and is climbing the wood like a living thing. The deck beneath his boots is hot. The air above it is a wall of orange. His officers are screaming for him to come down from the rigging. He is not coming down. He needs to see through the smoke. He needs to know where his ships are, where the forts are, whether the fleet is holding its course. He ties himself to the shrouds with a piece of rope so he cannot fall even if he is hit, and he watches the battle from 20 feet above the burning deck of his own ship. This moment, this specific image of a 60-year-old admiral tied to the rigging of a burning ship on a river that is itself on fire, is the moment that the history books love. It is the climax. It is the spectacle. But it is not the story. The story began months earlier in a series of letters that Farragut wrote to his wife Virginia, letters that sat in envelopes in her hands in New York, while her husband was somewhere on the Gulf of Mexico doing something that the Navy Department in Washington had privately decided was probably going to get him killed. Those letters contain the plan, not the official plan, not the one filed with the Secretary of the Navy, the real plan. The plan Farragut actually intended to execute and could not fully commit to paper in official correspondence, because if he had written it down in a formal dispatch and sent it to Washington, the men in Washington would have read it carefully and then they would have stopped him. To understand why those letters matter, you have to understand what New Orleans meant in the spring of 1862 and what it would cost to take it. New Orleans in 1862 is the largest city in the Confederacy. It is not the capital. It is something more important than the capital. It is the economic heart. It is the port through which the entire agricultural output of the Mississippi Valley, cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice, flows outward to the markets of Europe. The Confederacy's war machine runs on European credit, and European credit runs on Southern cotton, and Southern cotton flows to Europe through the port of New Orleans. The city handles more commerce annually than any other port in North America except New York. It sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which means it controls the artery that connects the entire interior of the continent to the world. Abraham Lincoln understood this with the clarity of a man who had floated a flatboat down that river as a young man. He is supposed to have said, early in the war, that the man who holds New Orleans holds the key to the continent. Whether he said it in exactly those words or not, he believed it. And so did every strategic mind in Washington. Taking New Orleans would not just cut the Confederacy's foreign commerce. It would split the Western theater of the war. It would give the Union control of the lower Mississippi. It would eventually link with the Union forces coming south from Cairo, Illinois under Grant, and threaten to cut the Confederacy in two along the river line. It would deny the South its greatest port, its greatest city, and its greatest psychological symbol of Southern civilization and power. New Orleans was where the South kept its soul. Taking it would be like driving a spike through the chest of the Confederacy. It would not end the war, but it would announce clearly to every cotton lord in Liverpool and every banker in Paris that the South was not going to win. The question was how to do it. The city sits 70 miles upriver from the Gulf of Mexico. The river bends and curves between New Orleans and the sea, and at a particularly tight bend called the Plaquemines Bend, the Confederates have built their defense. Fort Jackson sits on the western bank. Fort St. Philip sits on the eastern bank. Together, they form a crossfire that covers the entire river. Any ship coming upriver from the Gulf has to pass through the half-mile of water between those two forts. And between those forts and the Union fleet, the Confederates have stretched a barrier across the river. Old hulks of ships chained together end to end, held by anchors, fortified with logs and scrap iron, spanning the width of the Mississippi like a wall with forts behind it and Confederate gunboats patrolling in front of it. The conventional military wisdom of 1862 says this problem has one solution: bombard the forts until they surrender, bring up mortars, pound the masonry until the walls come down and the garrisons break and the white flag goes up. Then move the fleet upriver at leisure. This is the safe approach. This is the professional approach. This is the approach that protects the Navy Department from embarrassment if something goes wrong. It is also the approach that David Dixon Porter, commanding the mortar flotilla attached to Farragut's fleet, has been advocating since the mission was first planned. Porter is aggressive, ambitious, and enormously self-confident. He is also younger than Farragut. He wants credit. He wants his mortars to be the weapon that opens the river. He has told Washington that his mortar bombardment will reduce the forts within 48 hours. Porter and Farragut have a complicated history. Farragut is the senior officer. He holds the flag. The command is his, but Porter has political connections in Washington that Farragut does not. Porter has friends in the Navy Department. Porter has been the one lobbying for this operation, and there is a quiet understanding in certain Washington circles that Porter's mortar fleet is the tool that will do the actual work, that Farragut is there to provide the institutional seniority, and Porter is there to provide the operational genius. This arrangement is not written anywhere, but it sits in the air between them every time they sit down to discuss the plan. Farragut does not believe Porter's mortars will reduce the forts in 48 hours. He does not believe the mortars will reduce the forts in 48 days. He has looked at those forts. He has sent boats to measure the current, chart the depth, map the placement of the obstructions. He has studied the reports of the pilots who know this river, and he has reached a conclusion that he cannot fully express in official dispatches without triggering a political fight with Porter and the Navy Department that will slow everything down by weeks. His conclusion is this: you cannot reduce Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip by bombardment alone. The masonry walls are too thick. The earthwork revisions are too well built. You can fire mortars at those forts until you run out of shells and the garrisons will still be there. The only way to take New Orleans is to run past the forts. Accept the fire, absorb the damage, get the fleet above the forts, and let the forts become irrelevant, because your guns are now pointed at New Orleans and the Confederate supply line to the forts is cut. The garrison can surrender or starve. Either way, you own the river. This is the plan Farragut cannot commit to paper in a formal dispatch without a fight, but he commits it to paper in his letters to Virginia. He writes to her in the weeks before the operation with a precision and a candor that his official correspondence never allows. He writes about the forts. He writes about the barrier chain. He writes about his doubts, not his doubts about the plan itself, but his doubts about the men around him and about whether the Navy Department has the stomach to let him execute it. He writes that he has been given command of this expedition and that he intends to take New Orleans by going directly through whatever the Confederates put in his way. He writes that if the mortar bombardment does not succeed, and he does not believe it will, he will take the fleet upriver himself in the darkness and find out what the guns of Fort Jackson can do to iron-sheathed warships moving at speed. He writes to Virginia that he may not come back. He does not write this as a lament. He writes it as a professional assessment. If the fleet is destroyed in the passage, there is no retreat. Ships running downstream under fire from forts they have just tried to pass are easier targets than ships running upstream. Once the decision is made to run, the decision is made. It is a one-direction commitment, forward or nothing. He writes in one letter that his biographers would return to again and again that the taking of New Orleans is worth the loss of the fleet if the fleet is lost doing something that matters. He is 60 years old. He has been a naval officer since he was 9 years old, commissioned as a midshipman in the War of 1812 as a child, a fact that is astonishing and that the Navy of 1862 seems to have partially held against him. He is old. The men in Washington who debated his appointment worried that he was too old for an independent command of this scale, too old to make the fast decisions that a night action on a river would demand, too old to climb a mast if necessary. He was 60 years old and he was writing to his wife that he planned to climb the rigging of his flagship if that was what it took to see the battle through the smoke. He was writing this as a statement of personal intention in a private letter and not as a heroic declaration in an official report, because in an official report it would sound like exactly the kind of recklessness that his doubters were afraid of. The mortar bombardment begins on April 18, 1862. Porter's schooners move into position below the forts and open fire. The mortars are short, fat, stubby things that look nothing like the sleek deck guns of the warships. They fire shells in a high arc, lobbing them over the fort walls in a steep trajectory designed to drop ordnance directly into the interior of the fortification rather than trying to batter the walls from the front. It is an effective weapon. It is not an immediately decisive one. The shells land inside Fort Jackson, and they kill men, and they wreck things, and they set fires. But the fort does not fall. The garrison does not break. They go into their bomb-proofs, the deep shelters cut into the earthworks where the mortar shells cannot reach them, and they wait for the firing to slow, and then they come out, and they man their guns again. On the first day, Porter fires more than 2,900 shells at Fort Jackson. He expends a supply of ordnance that should have destroyed a medieval castle. Fort Jackson is still standing when the sun goes down. Days pass. The mortars keep firing. The forts keep standing. Farragut is watching the ammunition supply. He is watching the calendar. He knows that every day the fleet sits below the forts is another day the Confederates inside New Orleans use to strengthen their defenses and bring in reinforcements. He knows that the Confederate ironclad CSS Louisiana, a massive and powerful warship that is not yet fully operational, is being completed upstream and will become a serious threat if given time. He knows that spring is arriving and the river level will begin to fall, and the river pilots are already warning him that some of his heavier ships will ground on the sandbars if they wait too long. Time is running against him in a dozen different ways simultaneously. He calls a council of his captains on April 20th. He lays the situation in front of them. The mortar bombardment has not reduced the forts. He proposes to run past them. The reaction in the cabin of the Hartford is not unanimous support. His captains are professional naval officers. They understand the geometry of what he is proposing. 17 ships moving in column through a half-mile gap between two forts at night, with fire rafts on the river and Confederate gunboats on the water above the barrier, in a current that runs between 3 and 4 knots, requiring constant helm correction, in darkness broken only by the light of the fires. Several of his captains have serious reservations. They express them. Farragut listens. He does not dismiss them. He is not a general who confuses decisiveness with refusal to hear doubt. He takes the doubts into his own accounting, and then he makes his decision. But first, the barrier must be broken. The chain of hulks and scrap iron stretched across the river between the forts is the physical lock on the door. If the fleet cannot break through it, the passage is impossible. No ship can fight its way through a night action, absorbing fire from 2 forts simultaneously while also ramming its way through an anchored obstruction. The barrier has to be opened before the fleet moves. On the night of April 20th, Farragut sends Captain Henry Bell with 2 gunboats, the Itasca and the Panola, to attack the barrier in darkness. It is an extraordinary mission. 2 small vessels approaching the chain under fort fire in the middle of the night, trying to cut or blow open a gap wide enough for the fleet to pass through. Bell's men work under intermittent fire from Fort Jackson. They find a place where two hulks are chained together. They manage to detach a section. The opening is not large. It is barely wide enough for a ship of the line to squeeze through, but it is open. Farragut has his door. The night of April 23rd turns into the early hours of April 24th. Two red lanterns are hoisted on the Hartford at 2:00 in the morning. This is the signal. The fleet begins to move. The ships are not running dark. They have tried to darken themselves as much as possible, painting the hulls mud brown, hanging chain and hammock netting over the sides to protect against splinters, but they cannot disguise the white foam of their bow wakes or the glow of their engine fires. They are visible against the dark water. The order of the column is deliberate. Farragut has divided his fleet into 3 divisions. The 1st Division under Captain Bailey leads the way, taking the first fire. The Hartford leads the 2nd Division. Farragut is not sending others through first while he waits in safety. He is in the middle of it. The 3rd Division follows. The plan is to move fast, get through the fire zone as quickly as the river current and the engines allow. Do not stop to engage the forts. Suppress them with broadside fire as the ships pass, but keep moving. The guns of the ships are powerful, but they are not meant to reduce fortifications. They are meant to keep the Confederate heads down long enough for the fleet to get past. The first ships reach the barrier opening. They squeeze through. Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip open fire. The noise is catastrophic. The Confederate garrison gunners have been sleeping at their posts, waiting for exactly this, and they come awake with a speed that speaks to the fear and the adrenaline of men who know the fleet has come. Both forts are firing at maximum rate. The flash of the guns from the fort walls lights up the darkness in stuttering orange bursts. The shells are hitting ships. The USS Cayuga, leading the column, passes through the barrier and takes fire from both forts simultaneously. She is hit 11 times in the passage. She comes through. The USS Pensacola, following close behind her, takes worse damage. The column is spreading in the darkness and the smoke. Ships are losing sight of each other. Captains are making individual decisions about course and speed, and they are making them fast, in the dark, under fire, in a current that is always trying to push them into a bank. The Hartford reaches the barrier. She pushes through. She is in the killing ground now, the half-mile stretch of river between the 2 forts, fully exposed, taking fire from both sides simultaneously. The Confederate fire raft comes out of the darkness on the port side, pushed by the Confederate tugboat Mosher directly into the Hartford's hull. The burning pitch and tar hits the wood and catches. In seconds, the port side of the Hartford is on fire. The deck is burning. The men on the guns are trying to keep firing at the forts, while other men are trying to fight the fire on the deck beneath them. The executive officer is screaming for the helm to pull away from the raft. The engine room is getting orders that conflict with each other. Farragut is in the rigging. He can see through the smoke from up there. He can see the shapes of his other ships below him in the firelight and the cannon flash. He can see the gap in the barrier. He can see Confederate gunboats coming down from above. His ship is burning under his feet, and he is making command decisions with the detached clarity of a man who made his peace with this possibility 6 weeks ago in a letter to his wife. The fire crews beat out the flames on the Hartford's deck. The raft burns away from the hull and drifts downstream. The Hartford is through. The flagship is past the forts and still floating and still fighting. One by one, the rest of the fleet pushes through. The Confederate gunboat CSS Governor Moore charges directly at the Union vessels and fires her bowgun through her own forecastle, blasting through her own ship's decking to depress the gun low enough to fire at a Union vessel at close range. It is an act of improvised desperation and genuine courage by Lieutenant Beverly Kennan that accomplishes nothing against the weight of Union iron bearing down on him. The Governor Moore is battered and sunk. The Confederate ironclad ram CSS Manassas, a bizarre turtle-shaped vessel that looks like a floating cigar, makes her attack on the Union column and rams the USS Mississippi. The blow glances off. The Manassas is outgunned and outmassed, and she is eventually driven aground and burned by her own crew. By 4 in the morning, 13 of Farragut's 17 ships are past the forts. 3 vessels have been turned back by damage or the strength of the current. 1 has been sunk. The fleet is above the forts. New Orleans has no more defenses between it and the Union guns. The plan Farragut could not fully commit to his official dispatches has just been executed in a single violent night. The Confederate General Mansfield Lovell, commanding the land defenses of New Orleans, looks at the situation with the cold logic of a professional soldier. He has no ironclads left. He has no fortifications between the city and the Union fleet. He has militia and state troops, but militia and state troops cannot fight a naval bombardment from the levee. He pulls his forces out of New Orleans and marches them north toward the railroad that can carry them to somewhere useful. He evacuates rather than sacrifice his men in a pointless street fight against warships. The city is left to its civilians and its municipal government. On April 25th, Farragut's fleet anchors off the New Orleans levee. The city is in uproar. The citizens are burning their own cotton and their own ships to prevent them from falling into Union hands. The levee is thick with smoke from cotton bales and naval stores that the merchants are destroying rather than let the Yankees take. The streets are filled with angry crowds. Confederate flags still fly from the public buildings. Farragut sends a formal demand to the mayor of New Orleans, a man named John Monroe, requiring the city's surrender and the removal of all Confederate flags from public buildings. Monroe refuses to surrender. He sends back a letter that is a masterpiece of Southern legal obstinacy, informing Farragut that he does not have the authority to surrender a city to an armed force, that the military has already evacuated, and that if Farragut wants the city, he is going to have to physically take it from the civilian population and bear the moral weight of that action. Monroe is not bluffing. He intends to make this as awkward as possible. He intends to force Farragut to either bombard a civilian city, which would be a propaganda catastrophe, or land Marines and physically haul down the Confederate flags himself, which would be a humiliation. Farragut's response is characteristic of the man. He sends his Marines ashore. They march through streets full of hostile crowds. They climb the city hall. They haul down the Confederate flag. They raise the United States flag. The crowd screams and curses and throws things. The Marines hold their position. The flag stays up. New Orleans belongs to the Union. But the private letters. This is where the story completes itself. In the weeks following the fall of New Orleans, as the enormity of what has been accomplished settles onto Washington, a version of the event begins to be written that does not entirely match what actually happened. Porter's reports to the Navy Department emphasize the role of the mortar bombardment in weakening the forts and preparing the way for the passage. Porter is not lying in a crude sense. The bombardment did cause casualties inside the forts. It did damage things. But the forts did not fall because of the bombardment. They fell because Farragut went past them, which made them irrelevant. The difference between those two versions of the event is the difference between Porter being the decisive weapon and Farragut being the decisive weapon. The political battle over credit begins almost immediately. Farragut's letters to Virginia from the weeks before the battle sit in her possession in New York. They are private correspondence. They are not dispatches, and they are not reports, and they are not testimony at any inquiry, but they contain, in Farragut's own plain hand, the record of what he planned and why he planned it, and what he expected to happen and what he was prepared to accept. Those letters show a man who had already dismissed the mortar bombardment as the decisive action before it began. They show a man who told his wife in plain language that he intended to run past those forts in the dark, regardless of what the Navy Department thought about it, and regardless of what Porter's mortars accomplished. They show a plan that was formed independently of the official consensus, carried privately, and executed under circumstances that the official record tries to make sound more orderly and more consensus-driven than they actually were. The letters also show something else. They show the interior life of a man whose career had been built over 50 years of naval service, a man who had been a midshipman at 9 years old, and a combat veteran at 12, and a prisoner of war at 13, who had spent 5 decades doing the work of the Navy in a dozen forgotten corners of the world without becoming famous, without becoming a national figure, without accumulating the political connections and the celebrated reputation that a man of his abilities probably should have accumulated. He had been born in Tennessee and raised in Louisiana, and he had chosen the Union over his geography, the same way Thomas had chosen the Union over his family. He had sat in Norfolk at the beginning of the war and watched the Virginia officers he had known for 30 years walk away to the Confederacy, and he had stayed, and his staying had not made him popular or celebrated. It had just made him loyal. The letters to Virginia are the letters of a man who has been carrying a very large plan in a very small space for a very long time, and who is writing to the one person in the world he trusts completely, partly because he needs her to know what he intends to do in case he does not come back to tell her in person, and partly because writing it down to her is the only way he can think through it without the political noise of official channels drowning out the signal. He is thinking on paper. He is thinking to his wife. He is telling her the truth about New Orleans because he cannot tell anyone else the whole truth without creating a fight that wastes time he does not have. The letters survive. They are preserved and published years after the war by his son, Admiral Farragut, who understood that they contained something that the official record did not, which was the actual reasoning of the actual man at the actual moment of decision. They reveal that the fall of New Orleans was not primarily a triumph of mortar technology. It was not primarily a victory of overwhelming force. It was primarily the execution of a plan that one 60-year-old admiral formed in his own mind, communicated privately to his wife in letters he wrote with the full knowledge that he might not live to see the result, and then carried out in the dark on a river that was burning under his keel. There is a version of history that loves the image of Farragut in the rigging of the Hartford on the night of April 24th, tied to the shrouds with a piece of rope, watching his fleet run through fire and iron to take the greatest city in the Confederacy. It is a good image. It deserves the paintings and the statues and the school textbook paragraphs. But the real story is in the letters. The real story is in the weeks before the battle, when a man who everyone in Washington was slightly nervous about sat at a desk on a warship in the Gulf of Mexico and wrote to his wife that he had a plan and the plan was going to work, and he knew it was going to work because he had been looking at that river and those forts and that current for months, and the arithmetic said so. He didn't need approval. He didn't need Porter's mortars to make his case for him. He needed the gap in the barrier chain to be opened, and the red lanterns to go up, and the fleet to follow him north into the dark. The plan was private because the plan was his. He kept it private not out of deception, but out of protection. Protection of the time and the focus required to execute something that the official channels would have debated and delayed and politicized until the river level dropped and the season closed, and New Orleans sat behind its forts for another year while the Confederacy used the cotton revenue to buy rifles in Europe. The letters got out eventually. The letters always get out. When Admiral Farragut published them, the Navy read them, and the country read them, and the full dimension of what his father had planned and risked and carried alone through those weeks before the passage became visible for the first time. Not the heroic image, not the admiral in the rigging, the human image. The man writing to his wife at night on a ship in his own handwriting, telling her he may not come home, but that the plan was sound, and that New Orleans was worth the risk, and that if 60 years of service in the United States Navy meant anything at all, then this was the moment to find out. He came home. He took New Orleans. He went on to Mobile Bay 2 years later and said the line that became more famous than anything he ever wrote in those private letters. But the letters are where the real man lives. The letters are where the plan lives. And the plan was the river in the dark at speed, going forward and not stopping for anything. Not the forts, not the fire, not the politics, and not the doubt. The Mississippi is still there. It still bends past the place where Fort Jackson stood. The fort is still there, crumbling and moss-covered, sitting on the west bank of the river below Plaquemines Bend. The river runs past it the way it has always run, brown and heavy and indifferent to everything that happened on its surface in the spring of 1862, but the current still flows north. It still flows toward New Orleans. It still flows in the direction that Farragut pointed his fleet in the middle of the night when the river was burning, and the letters he had sent to his wife had already told her everything that was about to happen. He did not need to survive to be understood. He had already written it down.